My name's Julian. I currently work for the Methodist Church nationally, and I lead the grants team. And the grants that we allocate are given to churches and other organisations to increase their mission and their impact in British society. Before doing that, I was director of the Christian Muslim Forum, which is a national interfaith organisation seeking to bring Christians and Muslims together for better understanding, dialogue and practical action and campaigning. So some of the main things that we did at the Christian Muslim Forum, in our first year we launched a statement about Christmas. This was back in 2006. At the time there was a lot of uneasiness in the largely secular community about whether it was okay to wish people happy Christmas in a multi-faith society, and whether saying Merry Christmas publicly, giving Christmas cards, having Christmas trees in the workplace or in public places like town squares, whether that was offensive to Jews or Muslims. And that wariness led to lots of stories about Christmas being banned in different places or being renamed. And there's quite a lot of coverage about that in the winter, about how Christmas was being marginalised in what is largely a Christian country, and whether we were losing touch with our religious roots. Those stories were then picked up by some far-right organisations and by some of the media, where it was used as an accusation against the Muslims that Christmas was being banned because of Muslims. When we met as the Christian Muslim Forum, equal numbers of Christians and Muslims, we were able to discuss these issues, and it confirmed what we already knew, which was that Muslims didn't have a problem with Christians wishing people happy Christmas, and that they weren't upset that people were celebrating Christmas in Britain. So we were able to put together a joint statement saying how, as Christians and Muslims together, we were comfortable with each other's festivals, with Christmas, with Eid, with Diwali and Hanukkah in Judaism, and that we supported people's rights to continue to celebrate and to give people greetings and to be very open about it, and not to fall foul of excessive secular wariness or to jump onto the bandwagon of blaming any particular religious community. And the truth was that although people said, well, people of other faiths might be offended, none of them were. There were no actual stories of anyone being offended by Christmas being celebrated. Yes, so one of the dialogues that we did at the annual residential meeting of the Christian Muslim Forum was to open up a dialogue on Jesus Christ and the Prophet Muhammad. It took us a few years to get to that point of engaging with where we might have the most difference and where we're most divided and distinct as two separate religions. And that was a very useful exchange where one of our Imam colleagues told us about the Muslim appreciation of the Prophet Muhammad, the significance of Muhammad, and the theology that surrounds him, and the key concept of Muhammad being a mercy to the world in the Islamic tradition, followed by a very strong presentation from a Church of England priest on what Christians believe about Jesus, so talking about the Gospels, the virgin birth, which is something that both Christians and Muslims believe in, and what Christians believe about the cross, the crucifixion, and the theological beliefs that go with Christ's death on the cross, so atonement and salvation and God's forgiveness, and then moving on to resurrection in the Christian tradition. It took us a while to develop the friendship and the trust so that we were able to approach things that were more controversial. And then there were other events where we talked about Jesus and Muhammad together. Alongside that, I became aware quite early on in the time that I was at the Christian Muslim Forum that there were often local interfaith organisations who were getting together around about Easter time to talk about similarities between the death of Jesus Christ and the death of Imam Hussain, and the significance within the religious traditions of the death of key figures and the significance of that and the annual commemoration of it, whether it's at Easter or Muharram. And that was another useful example to learn from and pick up, and I think we covered it in some of our events where we looked at Jesus and Imam Hussain together. So when I first heard about Imam Hussain and read the story, I was shocked that he was the grandson of the Prophet, essentially sieged by the Caliph and receiving ends of this great battle where he's with a small group and there's this huge army surrounding him, and the appalling violence and brutality and how most of the Prophet's family was wiped out by this, and trying to understand how that could happen within the Muslim community where the figure of the Prophet Muhammad was so important, and that's passed on to his family, to his grandson, and then everything was just sort of thrown over. And there are parallels with what happened to Jesus. So his message was difficult in his time, and he fell foul of the authorities, and like Imam Hussain, he could have gone away, he could have avoided that confrontation, gone to a place of safety, but he continued fixed. In the Gospels it talks about how his face was fixed towards Jerusalem. So he could have escaped, but he wrestled in prayer and he asked God if there was an alternative, but he couldn't see that there was an alternative, and he was arrested and he was beaten and he was executed. So the parallels are very strong, and then the sort of redemptive quality that comes through the suffering, that people take strength from the suffering and they see that their founders, the pioneers, have gone to the end and beyond for their faith, and that gives us that commitment, gives us hope and assurance, and it shows that however awful the things that are happening or could happen, that our founders have been there before us. Yeah, I think key figures like Imam Hussain, Jesus Christ, the Prophet Muhammad, they can be role models for anyone who's heard of them, who's listened to their story, who's read about them, who's seen the things that they actually did rather than the negative things that people say about them. And for any of us to really try and understand where someone else is and what's really important to them, what's uppermost in their minds and hearts, to step into their shoes, you can't do that unless you think about what goes on in their lives, what goes on when they go to a place of worship, how they read their scriptures, what they think about their founders. And I think it would have to be a very rare person who, if they openly and genuinely and sincerely looked into another religion, so say it was Hinduism, we were talking about Krishna, or we were talking about the Buddha, not to be impressed by those people and to see the great things that they did and to be inspired by them, whether it was Gandhi, Martin Luther, or Malcolm X. We see what they did and the impact that they had, how they didn't compromise, they didn't run away from authority, and they kept on firm until the end. And that's one of the things that we often lack in society, not having good role models. Some of our good role models may be a long time in the past, they may be in a completely different tradition or religion or culture, but when we engage with them, then we can be inspired by them. And I think a lot of Christians who've looked into the story of Imam Hussain have been inspired by him, just as many Muslims are inspired by Jesus Christ in their own thinking and devotion and spirituality. I think more awareness of Imam Hussain would be beneficial to people. I mean, one of the things that could come out of that is they would understand the more difficult side of the origins of the split between Sunnis and Shias, while also recognising, if they look into it, that it wasn't as black and white as that there were people in the Sunni tradition who stood with Imam Hussain, and that there were very difficult times in the early years of Islam where there was a struggle between religion and the ideas of peace and devotion to God, and of politics and conquest and oppression, and how it was the religion which stood against oppression, just like it says in the Quran. And people don't know that, and from what they see, which is extremism, terrorism, and Daesh, and Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, they associate those things with Islam when those are absolutely not Islam. And if they wanted to see what Islam looks like in a time of war and conflict, they should be looking at Imam Hussain instead. One of the things that struck me a lot in spending years engaging with Muslims, going to Muslim events, seeing what's happening in the Muslim calendar, is the importance of key figures, whether it's the Prophet Muhammad and the celebration of his birthday, or the celebration of the coming of the Quran at Ramadan, celebration of Jesus' birth at Christmas and his death and resurrection at Easter. These are key points in not just the religious calendar, but the world calendar. And their significance lives on. It's not something that just happened once, but something that's always with us. And to think about whether we could forget about all that and put it to one side and say, well, we're modern people, we don't need to dwell on the past. What struck me a number of times, even with quite modern questions, and particularly the modern question of how we interact and how we coexist with each other. And in this country, we scratch our heads and we'll say, well, is Islam a problem? Are women wearing the burkini a big problem? We need to get rid of them or make them dress differently. We've somehow lost the idea of how to coexist. But then when we go back to the prophetic example of Jesus Christ and the Prophet Muhammad, we see them both engaging with different cultures, people of different ethnicities, different religions, people that they could have denounced as polytheists or completely non-religious people, people who are heretics or outside the norms for the day, and they dealt respectfully with them. So there's a number of occasions in the Gospels where Jesus met or talks about the Samaritans, who were regarded as not kosher, if you like, but within the Jewish community. They'd established their own temple. They had their own version of the religion with their own priesthood. Like in Christianity and Islam, we have the sort of offshoot groups who are not part of the mainstream, and often they're very marginalised and people are very negative or hateful towards them. So the Samaritans were a key example of a group that didn't fit into society and were commonly rejected and abused. And Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan who looks after someone who was assaulted on the road, takes them to an inn where they're looked after. So he chose the most hated character in the society to make the strong point of how we should be good neighbours to each other. And then we see that in the Islamic tradition. So there's a story about the Prophet where there's a man who comes into the Prophet's masjid in Medina and is urinating within the masjid. And the companions of the Prophet say, look, he's urinating, tell him to go away, or worse, sort him out. And the Prophet says, no, just leave him. He's here, he's just doing what he has to do, and treat him kindly. And there are other occasions, like the Prophet's neighbour, who used to throw rubbish on his doorstep every day, and then he comes out one morning, there's no rubbish there, and he's instantly concerned that something's wrong, on what's happened to the rubbish, where is the neighbour? And he goes and visits the neighbour who's ill and gives greetings of peace. And that neighbour is transformed by this encounter with someone that was hated. So we see our founders engaging with people who are very difficult and building bridges and including people. And in the story of Imam Hussain, he tried to negotiate with the Caliph. He offered an agreement based on the principles of Islam for coexistence and for a decent ruler, which he was prepared to sign and not continue any hostility with the Caliph, so that they could coexist as long as there was mutual respect. I'm not asking for too much, but just for coexistence. And we can see this across the traditions with the key people, and then we don't necessarily see it today. So we see newspaper headlines which say Muslims taking over, and we see all kinds of things. And we're just not thinking, we're not going back to see better examples, we haven't got the role models, and we're not committed, like our founders were, to peace and reconciliation, conflict resolution, which is the kind of thing that goes on here at St Ethelburga's, where people of all faiths and no faiths come and they explore difficult issues together and they work through conflict and reconciliation takes place. One of the things that we did here 2 years ago was prayers in the tent about the situation in Israel and Gaza. So prayer is central to our traditions. But not very often do we get together and we pray together. And we prayed in our own tradition with people praying their own prayers. And we had a couple of people from each religion, Christianity, Judaism and Islam, who prayed a prayer which we all said Amen or Ameen to. And it was a great gathering which was very transformative. We hadn't done it before, and I wondered why we hadn't done it before. But that's exactly the kind of thing that we get from our founders. So thinking of the example of the Prophet Muhammad, who was having a dialogue or a debate with a visiting Christian delegation, and it was time for them to do their prayers, and they said to the Prophet, well, we'll go out and we'll do our prayers somewhere else because this is your masjid. And he said, no, do your prayers here. But until we start to look into the other tradition, nobody knows that. So the average Christian won't know that, and there are even Muslims who aren't aware of this tradition, or they challenge it or reject it. But it's there. There's no denying that it's in the tradition, that it's part of the character, the personality of the Prophet Muhammad, setting such a great example. And then if we think today, can Muslims pray in my church? Can Christians pray in your masjid? It's a different story, but the answer was given long ago. So we need to be looking, because our founders are ahead of us. think the key lesson in the story of Imam Hussain and the hostility towards him and his eventual death surrounded by an attacking army is being firm and being committed. And that idea of commitment is central to our traditions. So you have the Shahada, I bear witness, there is one God, and we make similar declarations in church when we recite the creed, that it is about being fixed on a direction for life and on an attachment to the divine. And you can't remain in the tradition or in the religion if you let go of that. And if you want to go and put it aside and go your own way, then that's okay for those who decide to do that. But for people who belong in the tradition and stay in the tradition, there's no alternative. You can't say, okay, I'm going to commit to this, but when something happens, I'm just going to dump it. We don't see that in our traditions. We see people sticking it out to the end, being prepared to face death, because everyone's going to die. We don't want to have atrocity. We don't want anyone to be murdered for their faith. But for those who are committed, then they're going to stick to it, and it's direction for life, and it gives life. So if you decide, well, I'm not bothered about sticking with it, then it'll just disappear. You won't have that anymore.